So here's my working definition that I like to use for economics. Economics is the study of trying to satisfy unlimited wants. Unlimited wants with limited resources, yes. With limited resources. The study of trying to satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources. That's pretty general. I mean, this is really general. If we start to kind of pick this apart, and where it came from is when I was trying to explain this to my brother-in-law when he was only 11 years old, and he's like, Russ, what does economics mean? And I had to try to figure out how to explain this to an 11-year-old, and I didn't want to just get into money or businesses or markets and all that kind of stuff. So I said to him, Luke, why can't you have anything that you want? Now I'm asking an 11-year-old this. Ooh, deep question, right? Well, why can't you have, what really keeps us from having anything we want? What do you think his answer was? Can't afford it, right? Yeah, you need money. So it kind of brings you back to the money thing. And so then, that kind of highlights the Paris Hiltons out there, that they can have pretty much anything they want because they have wealth or access to resources and money and income. So my question's a little bit deeper than that. I said, why can't everybody have anything they want? All of us, the whole population. What really keeps us from having anything we want, right? And so we start thinking, oh, well, there's just not enough stuff. We need more. There's only a certain amount of goods out there, right? Well, what's the answer to that then? So I'm trying to take the onion peel, and I'm working with our unlimited wants, and I want to go a little deeper. Well, what causes us to have a lack of stuff, right? A lack of goods and services. Not enough resources, right? So we got to kind of peel the onion down and say, well, how do we make resources? Well, how do we make goods and services? We need resources. So then we kind of boil down to the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, the basic resources. If we think about our little green planet here, there's only so much of that stuff to go. There's the United States, the center of the world. A little off-center, I guess. But okay, so we got Europe, and Chinese are over here, and India, and Antarctica, and Greenland. So there's our planet, and we can think that, well, what's on this planet? Well, there is literally a fixed amount of land, labor, people, productive resources of people going to work, land, labor, capital. Now, capital is stuff that helps make other stuff. And so raw resources, natural resources falls into the land category. That's kind of the title we give it, as land, but it actually includes sunshine and wind and rain and all kinds of natural resources we kind of lump into the land category. So we got land, labor, capital, and this last one's kind of a wild card one, entrepreneurship. At any given point in time on this planet that's spinning around, we only have so much of that. That causes us to have to make choices. We can't have everything. Everybody can't have anything because of limited resources. That's where it all kind of comes from, is our resource base and what we have to work with. All right, so in the land category, again, you might want to put on here kind of all natural resources. So it might be dirt and land, trees and anything that's kind of naturally occurring. Labor, we can sometimes think of it as people, but it's really people available to work, so it's really labor hours, hours available. We need people willing and able to work, so we kind of need a labor force. Those of you who had macro class, we talked about the amount of people that are willing and able to work. So we have a constraint there of really a maximum amount. Capital is man-made stuff that helps us make other stuff. So capital are things like machines, tools, buildings, etc. Man, not natural, not God-made stuff, but man-made stuff. So we kind of got these two things. We got natural resources, man-made things, and then of course labor is kind of embodied in man. So we're down to the really basic core things of what's at our disposal to make things. Now, I want to point out right away that in finance class and some other circles, if you've watched the Shark Tank, how many of you watch Shark Tank? Love that show. You know, if a small business is trying to raise money, do they ever say, well, we need to raise some capital? Have you ever heard that word in the financial world? That, oh, we gotta raise capital, some seed money, right? So we use capital in finance class and in maybe some other business classes. We might use that loosely for raising money, but in econ class, capital is always physical things, physical man-made things, things that help make other things. Computers, this building is helping me produce this lecture today, right? The television, the Zoom, the software, all of that are materials that are being used in the production of the lecture. Okay, so in econ class, capital is always that stuff, not money. And then our wild card down here is entrepreneurship. Who's the person or entity that's pooling together these things? These things just don't combine themselves on their own, right? It takes some person to pool together the land, the labor, capital to make the eraser or to make the marker. That's our entrepreneur who's bringing that stuff down. I've got an entrepreneurial economics course, which I think is a lot of fun, where we really try to drill down, like, what exactly is true, pure entrepreneurship? And some argue that it's that innovation, it's that new thing. It's kind of creating something out of really nothing by just figuring out a better way to combine resources that brings something of value to the public, right? That new creative invention that comes about. All the stuff, our phones that we're carrying around, that's kind of really true entrepreneurship. And then sometimes that bleeds into a management. Management might be gathering resources to produce something on a given day. But the entrepreneur is the one that's kind of going through this creative destruction, is what Joseph Schumpeter coined it back in the day. Creative destruction. Creative destruction. We're always thinking that entrepreneur is coming up with new things, and it's really destroying the old way of doing it. It's putting people out of business. It's changing things, right? Creative destruction process. Kind of an amazing thing that helps bring about some economic growth. So if we have more entrepreneurship, if there's a way to encourage people to do that type of thing, that might be good for society in terms of economic growth. All right, so questions or comments on that so far? All right, so there's three basic questions that an economy needs to answer. And the economy is any gathering of I think, two or more people that are trying to make themselves better off through trade. And next time we'll work through a little example of that. So in the economy, we've got three questions that every economy must answer. the first one is what should be produced. What should be produced? The second one is how should those goods that we decided to produce, how should the goods be produced? And the last question is, for whom are the goods produced? Who's going to get the stuff? What, how, and for whom are the three basic questions that need to be tackled in any type of economy. Those questions, in theory, could be tackled by a central planner, a dictator. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got ways of organizing ourselves. So this is kind of a spectrum of governance in a way. So we might have at one end of the spectrum a dictator. So we got Fidel Castro comes to mind for Cuba, right? We can kind of make all of these decisions in the one single mind. One person comes up with those questions. We're only dealing with an economy of 30 people. Maybe it's a commune of hippies that was in Colorado, right? Sitting in a big cabin, all making love and bread and all kinds of stuff, right? That's an economy. If they were kind of self-contained and they were self-sufficient, maybe they went out and killed some things, brought it back. They might have lived that way for 3 years or something. That's an economy, right? They're engaged in trade. Maybe they can specialize in what they're good at and trade. You know, that could have been ran by one person. So we've had a couple examples where we've had these communes that were kind of ran by some radical people that were the head guru leader of the regime, right? So we got this idea of putting all these decisions into one single mind, a dictator. At the other end of the spectrum, we can have nobody in charge whatsoever. What do we call that? Begins with an A. Anarchy. Anarchy. So we just anarchy. Did I spell it right? It's a little weird. Okay. So no government, right? So this is kind of really nobody's in charge. There's no government. One end of the spectrum. So we put all the power with one single mind, or nobody's got it, right? Kind of two ways to do this. And so our market system that we have in the United States is off of anarchy and somewhere in the middle here. In the good old days, it used to be maybe a little more this way, but not necessarily, in my humble opinion. But somewhere over here is maybe the good old US of A. The freest nation in the world, right? The freest nation in the world where everybody can go out and do their own thing. Now, it's not anarchy, right? Because what's there to keep people in check? Their freedom that they have in the United States. Go out and start their own business, do their own thing, burn down their house if they want to, as long as they're not committing insurance fraud and they actually own it. Laws, right? So it's not the rule of a king or a queen, like a monarchy. It's not a rule by man or woman. It's a rule of law. We're going to take out the discretionary element altogether and put together this constitution that's going to rule the land. Suck out that discretion, that distortion, because what they found over time, over the last 2,000 years, prior to 1776, with the good old US of A starting up, is they found that governments tended to gravitate towards more and more limited power, right? And that power was in the hands of the few. Everybody else was dirt poor. And that's the way the earth, the world, looked all over the place. That was the common thing. And so our founders in the United States said, you know, let's have a rule of law rather than a rule by man. So rule of law. That means you can't hurt your neighbor, right? You can't steal from your neighbor. So you kind of stick to yourself. You've got freedoms. But with a good rule of law, there's one of the most important ingredients is property rights. The right to own something and control it and use it and dispose of it. Those laws are set up to protect those property rights. And so property rights is another major ingredient in this system. Property rights. Unlike some other countries, when you buy and own something, you have some special rights in the United States. If somebody steals this from you, then you can call the police and they will be arrested and thrown in jail potentially, right? If you give harm to one another, if somebody's not following the rule of law, then we have a police system in place to take care of that. So we cherish property rights. If you go to some of the poorest nations in Africa, you'll find that that's one of the key things they're missing. Most of the underdeveloped world is missing this key ingredient of property rights. People don't know what they own, the government's corrupt, and so they'll just take it anyway and confiscate their property. And so you live at a subsistence level at that point, where you can't accumulate wealth because the odds of somebody taking it are good. And so you tend to consume your wealth right away, and you might live okay at this, what we call a subsistence level, but it's very difficult to accumulate assets, to accumulate wealth, because of a lack of property rights and a rule of law. Okay, so that's kind of a little thumbnail sketch of what started to set the United States apart in what we call mostly a free market. Now, we don't operate in a free market, so anybody that says we have free market capitalism in the United States, that's just not true. We were probably close to it back in the 1800s, and that's when we saw some tremendous growth in the United States. But there's been a natural progression, starting especially those of you who are in macro class. What happened in the 1930s? 1929, the Great Depression. So we started to kind of steer away from the free market aspect, because we're like, man, this really sucks. We're in the dumper. Well, now it turns out there's kind of some different theories of whether it really was the free market that caused it in the first place, or whether there was some other things going on through a concentration of power in particular places that might have caused just as much harm during the Great Depression as any free market capitalism would have. So we tend to kind of drift towards bigger and bigger government has been the trend since the 1930s. And right now, we are at a rate of government that's never been seen before in terms of the amount of economic activity that the government actually makes up in terms of their spending and transfers. So it's a time where we'll see the political debates come up again on what direction the United States is going to head, whether it's more limited government or bigger and bigger government. One of the problems that we'll look at throughout the semester is economists are completely anti-big business. I guess if you're a pro-capitalist, it doesn't mean that you are pro-big business. Big business tends to get into bed with big government, and then we start to have this concentration of power of potentially a few firms or smaller and smaller businesses that are able to impose regulation to keep competitors out. And so it can be very anti-capitalist to have big business kind of rule the roost. So my point with that is to kind of take a knock on the Republicans, if you thought I was like leaning too much towards the anti-Democrat there for a second. A lot of Republicans aren't really in this line of thinking of limited government either. Some Republicans are just as guilty. Again, some Republicans are just as guilty of moving towards that bigger government model. They might be pro-business, but that isn't necessarily pro-market, where we try to encourage competition within the market. Okay, so in the market system, we have that supply and demand going on. What should be produced? Who does that? Producers or consumers? So if we've got households over here and businesses over here, who decides what? I heard consumers? Consumers. All right, so there's this thing called what we call consumer sovereignty. The consumer reigns. The consumer is king in the market system. So we say they want something, they will get it as long as they have the ability to pay for it. Because our producers, it's not the build it and they will come concept, although some of those true entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs might say, well, consumers don't know what they want yet until I figure it out for them, right? And there's a hint of truth to that there's a difference between thinking about future goods and current goods. But for the most part, if we're modeling a business as wanting to make a profit, then they're going to build what these people want. So that's the point of the consumer sovereignty. So how the goods are produced, how do we do it? Where does that get determined? With the producer. A little bit more on the producer side, and in the marketplace, it's the resources. So the story that I like to tell, I know we're almost out of time, is when I went to Mazatlan for spring break, and I went down to Mexico and I saw a group of 3 Mexican males mowing the lawn. And this is what I saw. They had each one of them had a sickle and they were doing this. Right? And some of my friends who went to Daytona Beach, if they looked out the restaurant, saw the lawn being mowed, what did they see? A big rider, right? One person on a big machine, right? So the question of how should we mow the lawn, what determines that? Do we take the 3 guys, and then let's just assume that the lawn gets mowed, the product is the same at the end. How should we do it? Depends on the mix of resources within the economy. The United States is capital rich, machine rich, if you will. And Mexico is labor rich in terms of there's lots of additional labor around. So it has nothing to do necessarily with cheap labor, although that might be a result of it. But the ratio of machines to people is different in Mexico than it is in the United States. And so the how question tends to be answered with a more capital-intensive production method in the United States and a more labor-intensive production method in Mexico. And then finally, this for who's going to get it. The people who get it, we kind of hinted about it with Paris Hilton, are the people who own the resources. Because that's how you generate an income in the resource market, through your getting your bachelor's degree in that high-paying job, hopefully after you leave Ottawa University, right? You command a higher pay, and that means you get some more stuff. All right, we'll pick up there on Wednesday. Keep a heads up for your email on those course IDs.